Welcome to history's butterfly effect. Here we wander through the quiet corners of time, where small moments ripple outward and shape the world in ways no one could have imagined. These are not just stories of battles and crowns, but stories of chance and choice, of love and loss, of people whose lives touched history, sometimes in ways they never knew. So find a comfortable place, let your mind grow still, and let the past open like a book. Together, we'll follow the delicate wings of history's butterfly and see how one tiny moment can change everything. The year is 1914, and the world feels as if it is standing on the edge of greatness. Cities are alive with light and sound, the hum of electric trams, the ringing of church bells, the chatter of markets filled with bread and fruit and laughter. Across the continent, people dream of progress, of inventions that promise to make life longer, richer, easier. The telephone is spreading from city to city. The automobile rattles along cobblestone streets. Airplanes rise briefly above fields, fragile wings carrying fragile hopes. It is a time of promise, and yet beneath the promise there is unease. Empires cover the map like great crowns placed upon the earth. The British Empire, stretched across oceans, commands the seas with its mighty navy. France, proud and bright, still clings to memories of past glory, while nursing the wound of defeat by Germany decades before. Germany itself is rising, young and hungry, filled with industry, its factories burning coal into the sky, its soldiers drilling with precision. Russia stretches endlessly, vast, cold, ancient, ruled by the Tsar and his family in glittering palaces, while peasants till the frozen ground far away. And in the very heart of Europe lies Austria-Hungary, a patchwork empire of languages, peoples and dreams, bound together by tradition, ceremony, and the crown of an aging emperor. But inside this quilt of nations, threats are fraying. The Balkans, that turbulent corner of southeastern Europe, is restless. Serbia, proud and determined, dreams of uniting Slavic peoples under its flag. In coffee houses and smoky taverns, words like independence and destiny are whispered with excitement and defiance. To Vienna, to the halls of Austria's rulers, Serbia is not just a neighbor. It is a spark too close to dry straw. Yet on the surface, life goes on. Carriages clatter through Vienna's wide boulevards. Newspapers are sold on street corners with headlines about art, about politics, about small scandals in high society. Children run through gardens, their shoes kicking up dust. Lovers stroll by rivers under gaslight lamps. To ordinary people, the storm clouds of politics seem far away, and the warmth of summer feels safe. Few can imagine that before the year is out, the laughter of children will give way to the silence of mourning in millions of homes. Among the nobility of Austria, one man carries his own burdens. His name is Franz Ferdinand, nephew of the emperor, heir to the throne. He is serious, sometimes stern, a man of strong opinions. He is not loved by all at court, but he is respected, and he has a vision for the future of the empire. He believes it must change, must give more dignity and space to the many different peoples within its borders. Some think this makes him wise, others think it makes him dangerous. But he does not bend easily to the will of others. And he has another mark against him in the eyes of tradition, his heart. Franz Ferdinand falls in love not with a princess of royal blood, not with a woman chosen for political advantage, but with Sophie Chotek, a lady-in-waiting of noble but lesser rank. For this, he is scorned by some, restricted by the rigid laws of his house. Their marriage is considered unequal, what the court calls morganatic, meaning Sophie will never be empress and their children will not inherit the throne. Yet, despite whispers and cold glances, they marry, and they find happiness together. They laugh with their children. They write affectionate letters when apart. They share a life that is warmer and more genuine than many marriages of their station. The summer of 1914 brings them on a journey. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie travel to Bosnia, provinces under Austrian rule, to observe military exercises and to appear in the capital, Sarajevo. The city, with its narrow streets and steep hillsides, its mix of mosques and churches, its bridges over the Miljacka River, is alive with anticipation. For some, the visit is a chance to see royalty, to glimpse the future emperor. For others, it is a provocation, a symbol of foreign rule. In the shadows, young men prepare. They are members of secret societies, filled with ideas of nationalism, of freedom, of striking a blow against empire. Among them is a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. Thin, dark-eyed, often sickly, he does not look like a figure who might change history. Yet in his pocket, he carries a small pistol, and in his mind, he carries a dream of defiance. The stage is set, though no one walking the streets of Sarajevo that morning knows it. The river flows quietly under the bridges. Shopkeepers open their shutters. Carriages and trams begin to move. Women in long skirts carry baskets to market. A boy sells newspapers at the corner, his voice sharp in the summer air. Life is ordinary, completely ordinary, and yet, in that ordinariness, destiny waits. As the Archduke's train approaches the city, Franz Ferdinand sits with Sophie. It is their wedding anniversary. They are rarely allowed to appear together at official events, and yet today, they will ride side by side in the open car. For them, this feels like a small joy, a chance to be husband and wife in public as well as in private. He wears his uniform, medals glinting in the morning light. She wears a pale dress, simple but elegant, her smile calm, her hand resting lightly in his. The cars line up, engines humming. Soldiers stand at attention. Crowds begin to gather along the planned route. Some cheer, some watch in silence, some mutter under their breath. And scattered among the crowd, waiting, are the young conspirators, their hearts pounding, their hands clenched, their nerves stretched tight. The city seems to hold its breath, though no one yet knows why. The motorcade begins to move. Along the river, car after car glides forward, officers seated stiffly, soldiers glancing at the crowd, banners swaying in the summer air. On one bridge, a young conspirator steps forward and throws a grenade. It arcs through the air, strikes the folded cover of the Archduke's car, and bounces off, rolling beneath the next vehicle. An explosion cracks the morning. The car behind is damaged, its passengers wounded. The Archduke's car speeds ahead, escaping the smoke. The conspirator swallows a vial of poison and leaps into the river, but the poison fails and the water is too shallow. He is dragged out, coughing, beaten by furious policemen. The attempt has failed. At City Hall, the Archduke's anger burns. He interrupts speeches, declaring he has come to see his subjects, not be greeted with bombs. Yet when he hears of the wounded, he insists he must go to the hospital to visit them. Sophie is at his side. Despite the danger, despite the warnings, they choose to continue. The cars roll again through the streets. But confusion reigns. The drivers are not told that the route has changed. And so, at one fateful corner, the lead driver turns into a street where he should not have gone. The car slows, then stops, trying to reverse. The engine coughs, the gears grind, time itself seems to hesitate. And there, standing on the sidewalk, is Gavrilo Princip. The young man who thought his chance had been lost, now sees the Archduke's car, motionless, within reach. He steps forward. His hand trembles but his will is steady. He raises the pistol, aims and fires 2 shots. The first strikes Sophie. She gasps, her hand clutching her abdomen, her eyes wide in shock. The second strikes Franz Ferdinand in the neck. He leans toward her, his voice hoarse, his uniform stained with blood. "Don't die, Sophie," he whispers, though the words are heard differently by different ears. "Stay alive for the children." But within minutes, both are gone. The crowd erupts in chaos. Princip is seized, beaten, pulled by police from the mob that wants to kill him. The Archduke and his beloved wife lie dying in the back seat of the car. Their last moments shared together. Their hands close even in the silence of death. The shots echo not only through Sarajevo, but across all of Europe. Telegrams begin to fly. In Vienna, anger and grief mix with calculation. In Berlin, the Kaiser offers his support. In Russia, the Tsar vows to stand with Serbia. The gears of alliance, built for deterrence, now begin to lock into motion. And so, with 2 bullets fired by a frail young man on a street corner, the fuse of the 20th century is lit. The news traveled quickly, faster than the smoke from the pistol drifted over the river, faster than the frightened crowd broke and scattered along the stone embankment. A clerk in a telegraph office bent over his key and tapped the letters with the careful speed of someone who knows the world is listening. In a nearby room, another clerk did the same, eyes on the clock, breath held between each word as if the gaps were respectful silences for the dead. Archduke assassinated. Then, after a pause that felt like a prayer, wife also slain. The message leapt from wire to wire, from Sarajevo to Vienna, to Berlin to St. Petersburg, to Paris and London, and then on again, echoing in headlines and morning editions and whispered conversations where people leaned in close, as though volume could change the meaning of what had happened. In Vienna, marble corridors carried the sound of hurried steps. Doors that were always opened slowly, ceremoniously, now swung with a practical urgency that made the brass hinges complain. Franz Joseph, the old emperor, received the news with the gravity of a man who has known too many losses and still must keep his posture straight. He and his nephew had disagreed about reforms, about the shape of the empire's future. Affection had never quite found its footing between them. But dynasties are not made only of liking and disliking. They are made of duty, of chain and link, of inheritance that now had a broken link where an heir should have stood. The emperor's face did not show surprise, only the weighing of consequences. Outside the palace, the city tried to decide which emotion would be allowed to take the lead. Grief presented itself first, dressed in black and with a handkerchief in its glove. Anger was only a step behind, louder, hot-blooded, already shaping itself into statements that began with they and ended with must pay. In cafes, men who argued about everything suddenly agreed about one thing. Serbia, they said, as if naming an answer solved the question. The newspapers used harder fonts and fewer adjectives. A tailor, head bowed over the gray cloth he had been cutting for an officer's new uniform, let his shears rest and said into the fabric, "There will be trouble." He did not know what kind. He only knew the color of it. The funeral, when it came, was smaller than the sorrow. Protocol, rigid as a winter branch, dictated what honors were allowed. Sophie's rank, diminished in life, was diminished again in death. It hurt people who had not cared before about rank or precedence to see cold rules applied to warm bodies. The 2 coffins lay side by side, and yet ceremony held them a little apart. Those who loved them felt the distance. In the galleries, a few women cried openly. In the press boxes, a few men wrote without looking at the page, their eyes on the faces of the children who had not been permitted to stand too close. But mourning did not take up all the space in Vienna. Strategy hurried in and set papers on the table. In government offices, men drew close over maps like doctors over a patient's chart, not cured by consulting it, but reassured by the process. A memorandum became a draft, became a decision, each step tied to the last by the same sentence. Serbia must be taught a lesson. In Berlin, far from Vienna's particular grief, the promises were straightforward. The Kaiser assured Austria-Hungary of his support, what the world would later call a blank check, though no one there used such a casual phrase. It was written in the ink of alliance and honor, in the unspoken belief that speed would keep the problem small. In Belgrade, the government read the air as one reads the approach of a storm, by the heaviness, by the way birds go quiet. The Prime Minister walked a little faster from room to room. His staff spoke more softly, as if not to jar the fragile moment between peace and its opposite. Serbia had its own pride, its own wounds, its own young men who felt a fire in their throats when they said the word freedom. It also had mothers who could count sons on one hand, and did not wish to count them on graves. A village woman, hearing the city's rumors from a peddler passing through with tin goods and needles, stood in the doorway and watched the road, as if the first sign of war would arrive as a visible object one could choose not to let in. The ultimatum arrived with the weight of an iron door swinging shut. Its demands were dressed as investigations and guarantees, but their meaning was naked. Bow not only in public, but in the private rooms of sovereignty itself. Serbia read and read again. Pride straightened its back. Survival put a hand gently on its shoulder and pressed down, urging a lower posture. The reply was drafted with care, offering much, conceding more, trying to leave at least a corner of the nation's dignity uncovered. There are times when a word like almost feels like salvation. This was not one of those times. The acceptance was not complete, and the space left between what was demanded and what was granted was exactly large enough for war to walk through. Vienna declared hostilities. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar and his ministers took counsel with history and blood and kinship. The Slavs of Serbia were not only neighbors on a map. They were, in the Russian imagination, cousins whose troubles carried a familial echo. Russia moved to mobilize, first in part, then more fully as the momentum gathered like a snowball taking the slope. Mobilization is a word that sounds clean on the tongue, but in practice it is 1,000 soot-streaked locomotives groaning into motion, 1,000 switchmen throwing levers, 1,000 mothers packing a spare shirt and bread into a canvas bag, and tucking a saint's icon into a pocket as if faith could be sewn to fabric. Germany saw Russia's movement and heard responsibilities call in it. The promise to Austria-Hungary was not poetic. It was mechanical, crank turning crank. Diplomatic notes were sent across the wires, crisp in tone, insistent in timing. When the answers did not bend the machinery back into stillness, declarations followed. First against Russia, then against France, as old plans unrolled like blinders. In Paris, men who had grown up under the long shadow of the last Franco-Prussian War felt something like a grim satisfaction and a private dread. The ledger of history might be balanced, they told themselves. But everyone knows what accounting costs. Across Europe, people tried to live as if decisions made in capitals were only weather reports. A bread seller in Prague counted coins and thought about the price of flour. A young violinist in Krakow played a song for his sweetheart in a courtyard where the echo was kind and promised to play it again when he returned, though he did not yet know he would not be hearing it in a courtyard again, but only in memory, and memory's acoustics are not the same. A railway porter in Lviv checked tickets and thought of the quiet fields beyond the station, where the wind moved through wheat without asking permission from anyone. The British cabinet considered its steps with deliberate pace. Britain's gaze often turned to the sea first. The island measured danger by the horizon. Belgium's neutrality stood like a small, clear candle in the room. Easy to overlook when talking of empires, but stubborn in its light. As Germany prepared to move west not straight, but in a sweep through Belgian ground, the candle became a lantern. What had been an argument about continental balance and obligations began to look like a question about promises made in ink that ought not to fade in the rain. Meanwhile, the wires continued their rapid whispers. Emperors and kings exchanged personal telegrams that history would later read, as if they were letters between cousins trying to keep a family dinner from turning into a quarrel in front of the children. Each hoped the other would do the one thing that would make it possible for him to relax his own posture. Each believed that only firmness would prevent collapse. Firmness has a way of making doors stick where they might have swung. In Vienna's cafes, several conversations happened at once. A journalist argued that the empire must act or be seen as a lion whose mane is only for show. A schoolteacher said softly that lions do not always hunt because they are hungry. Sometimes they hunt because the body has learned a rhythm and cannot refuse the drum. A student, his lips still red from biting them, said nothing. He thought of the shots and the two people in the car, of the way love had been punished by rank, of how the world had been punished by chance. He did not tell anyone he had dreamed the night before of hands reaching for each other, and missing because a street had turned the wrong way. On a July evening, a telegraph office worker in Budapest straightened his tie before delivering a message to a minister's home. He had not eaten. The message was heavy in his hand, and the city was so hot that even the ironwork on balconies felt like part of a stove. He would later remember the moment not for the contents of the note, but for the way the minister thanked him, took the paper, and then paused for exactly the length of 2 breaths before breaking the seal. Between those 2 breaths, the clerk felt the entire world hanging by a thread fine enough to cut skin, and invisible enough to ignore if one wanted to. Troop trains began to roll in more places than one could count. Men leaned from open carriage doors and waved caps at people they didn't know who waved back. A human instinct to bless departures even when the destination is unknown. Children ran alongside until the platform ended. Someone tossed a paper cone of cherries up to a friend. It fell, and the cherries scattered on the planks like old wax beads. A chaplain closed his book around his finger to keep his place and looked up at the faces. Brave, frightened, bored, thrilled, resigned. The mixture is the same in all wars, only the uniforms change. From Berlin came the sound of speeches and parades, the careful theater of confidence that leaders perform when the ground is shifting under their feet. In St. Petersburg, churches filled with candlelight as women stood in lines to light wicks and whisper petitions that had no addresses but reached anyway. In Paris, a cafe pianist played something bright, because the owner thought people would drink more if they didn't have to think. In a small town in Galicia, a farmer came in from the fields at dusk, dust in the cuffs of his trousers, and found a paper tacked to the door of the municipal hall. A notice summoning names like a fisherman pulling a net, and his was among them. The days of late July turned the corner into early August the way a clock hand moves, without permission, without drama, and with consequences. A map of Europe that had been a lesson in schoolrooms began, line by line, to become a list of fronts. Diplomacy had said everything it could say. The vocabulary expanded to include artillery and timetables. If anyone had asked the people at the edges, the porter, the violinist, the tailor, the clerk, whether they wanted a thing so large it would swallow their lives, the answers would have been as varied as human nature. But no one asked them. History rarely conducts surveys before it acts. And still, even as decisions hardened, the world offered small, stubborn proofs of gentleness. A policeman in Vienna guided an old woman across a street wider than her legs could manage in one light. A baker in Belgrade doubled the sugar in a batch of rolls because he had heard the soldiers were leaving in the morning and sweetness, like a blessing, should be given at the threshold. A postman in a Bohemian town tucked 2 letters into the same doorframe. One summoning a son to service. One from a girl who didn't know about the summons yet, full of plans for a Sunday walk. The house held both futures in the same wood for an hour. And if there is any mercy in the world, it is sometimes exactly that, an hour. By the time August announced itself fully, the machine was in motion, and could no longer pretend to be a set of separate levers. Austria-Hungary had its war with Serbia. Russia had its mobilization. Germany had its declarations. France stood with its ally. Britain stood in the doorway, listening to the floorboards, and reached for the handle. The rails sang under the weight of moving armies. The roads filled with dust. On the platforms, handkerchiefs made small white clouds as they waved, and then the trains turned those clouds into nothing, carrying faces away to places whose names had the sound of fate. The world that had been so confident in June, that had believed in the power of invention and the inevitability of progress, did not vanish. It stepped aside like a courteous host, and let something older and more ruthless take the center of the room. The moment of the shots in Sarajevo had begun as a sharp intake of breath. Now, across a continent, the breath was let out in a long, low sound that was not quite a sigh and not yet a cry. And with that exhale, the first moves of war reached from planning table to open field, from telegram to troop train, from the language of diplomacy to the grammar of violence. The lamps in the cities still burned that night, and the stars above them burned with indifference. Somewhere a night watchman tapped his staff on the stones at the hour, and called it out as if keeping time could keep order. Somewhere a newly married couple whispered future children's names with a tenderness that did not yet know how fragile such lists are. Somewhere a boy who had read every newspaper headline wrote a headline of his own in a school notebook, and underlined it twice. And in the morning, wherever morning came first, uniforms were buttoned, and feet found the road, and the century took the turn it had been approaching all along. August came, heavy with heat, as if the air itself were reluctant to move. Across Europe, days were long and bright, and people still went to market, still gathered in cafes, still greeted one another with polite nods. Yet behind the small rituals of daily life, something immense had shifted. Newspapers bore headlines that struck like hammer blows. Austria at war with Serbia, Russia mobilizing, Germany declaring war on France. Each headline carried the world closer to the unimaginable. And then at the turn of that month, came the step that would draw nearly everyone in. The crossing of Belgium. Belgium was small, proud, and neutral, its neutrality guaranteed by treaties stretching back nearly a century. To many in Europe, it seemed unthinkable that this modest kingdom would become the pivot of the crisis. Its fields were known for wheat and cattle, its cities for lace and trade. Its people had never asked to be part of the quarrels of empires. And yet, in the German war plan, Belgium was not neutral ground. It was a road. To strike France quickly, Germany intended to sweep through Belgium's flat fields and quiet towns, circling down into northern France like a scythe. The generals called it necessity. Belgium would call it invasion. On the 2nd of August, Germany delivered its ultimatum. Safe passage or war? Belgium refused. King Albert, quiet and dignified, declared that his country was not a corridor, not a carpet to be walked upon. His words, calm as they were, carried the weight of defiance. And so in the early hours of August 4th, German troops crossed the border, gray-green uniforms advancing in columns that seemed endless. Boots struck dust from the summer roads. Horses pulled cannons heavier than houses. Villagers stood in doorways, watching in silence, some crossing themselves, others clutching their children close. Neutrality was no shield now. At Liège, the first great clash came. The fortress city, ringed with forts dug into the hills, became a symbol. Belgian soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with stubborn ferocity. The forts shook under the pounding of German artillery. Concrete split, stone shattered, the air filled with dust and fire. Yet the defenders held longer than anyone expected, forcing the Germans to pause, to fight, to bleed. A few days' resistance does not sound like much in the scale of war, but those days were precious. France used them to mobilize. Britain used them to decide. Belgium, small as it was, had given the world time. The German advance, though slowed, did not stop. Villages fell, fields filled with troops, and the stories began to spread. Houses burned, towns punished for resistance, civilians shot as examples. Refugees streamed westward. Old men pushing carts, mothers carrying babies, children stumbling with exhaustion. Their voices carried tales of terror. And those tales spread faster than the armies themselves. In Paris and London, in Amsterdam and Rome, the stories filled newspapers. Belgium, once a distant name, was now the face of suffering, the innocent victim of a giant's march. In London, the cabinet debated late into the night. Britain had long weighed whether to intervene, torn between caution and commitment. But the invasion of Belgium changed everything. Decades earlier, Britain had signed a treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. Now that promise was tested. Some argued that treaties were only words, but others countered that if promises were ignored, no nation could trust another again. The Prime Minister, Asquith, listened, and the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, looked out at the gas lamps being lit in the streets below. He is said to have murmured, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." And so Britain declared war on Germany. The final balance tipped. The great powers were all in. Across the continent, the mood was at once somber and feverish. In Berlin, crowds gathered in the streets, cheering the marching columns, singing patriotic songs. Young men promised their mothers they would return by Christmas. In Paris, the army set out in bright uniforms, red trousers and blue coats, marching beneath the tricolor as women tossed flowers. In London, volunteers crowded recruiting stations, some exaggerating their age, others concealing their fears beneath wide smiles. The stations were filled with chatter, with laughter even, as though the war were an adventure. On train platforms, families waved handkerchiefs, kissed cheeks, clung to hands until the final whistle forced them apart. Coal smoke rose, trains rolled, and voices grew faint in the distance. Yet at the front, the mood was different. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, marched into Belgium and met the Germans at Mons. Along the canal, the rifles of British infantry cracked with such speed and precision that German officers believed they faced machine guns. Soldiers dropped in lines, the water of the canal rippling with bullets. For a time, it seemed the British could hold. But the German army was vast, a tide that could not be stopped by precision alone. Under pressure, the British began their long retreat, marching in the heat, boots blistering, uniforms soaked with sweat. They fought, withdrew, fought again. It was grim work, but in those exhausting days, they bought time for the French, kept the line from collapsing, gave Paris a chance to breathe. The French armies too struggled. At Charleroi and along the frontier, they fought bravely but suffered heavy losses. Plans drawn up in quiet rooms before the war met the brutal reality of modern weapons. Men fell by the thousands, whole regiments shattered in hours. Officers in gleaming sabers and bright coats became easy targets for rifles and machine guns. Still, they pressed forward, driven by pride, by duty, by the memory of defeat in 1870 that burned like an ember in the national heart. The price was terrible, but retreat was unthinkable. Through it all, the civilians bore witness. In Belgian villages, churches burned, and bells that had tolled for centuries melted into silence. Families fled down dusty roads, clutching what little they could carry. Some were caught in the tide of armies, swept away in battles they did not choose. In France, farmers left fields of wheat standing tall, abandoning harvests to the trampling boots of soldiers. In Germany, women queued for bread, scanning the horizon for letters that would not arrive. The war, though weeks old, was already everywhere. And yet, amid the fire and smoke, life clung stubbornly. In a small French village, women gathered to knead dough together in the square, their hands moving in rhythm as artillery thundered far away. In a German regiment, a soldier pulled a harmonica from his pack and played a tune from home. The men around him closed their eyes and let the music carry them, for a moment, to kitchens and gardens left behind. In Britain, children traced maps in schoolrooms, following with their fingers the lines of rivers and frontiers, speaking aloud names like Liège and Mons, though they did not understand the blood spilled there. The war was no longer a possibility. It was here. It was in the broken stones of Liège, in the smoke of burning towns, in the sobs of mothers on station platforms, in the sweat of soldiers retreating step by step. What had begun with 2 shots in Sarajevo was now a fire stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. And though the parades still played, and the speeches still promised victory by autumn, something deeper had already taken hold. The war would not end quickly. It would not be kind. It had dug its roots into the soil of Europe, and it would take more than a season to tear them out. The summer of 1914 was supposed to end in triumph. At least, that is what so many of the generals and politicians had promised. German plans, drawn up in quiet rooms years before, were being followed with mechanical precision. Sweep through Belgium, crush France before Russia could fully mobilize, Turn then to the east. The Schlieffen Plan was meant to be a blueprint for victory, a short and decisive war. And at first it seemed to be working. Belgium had resisted bravely, but was being overrun. The British Expeditionary Force had fought hard at Mons, but was in retreat. French armies had suffered terrible losses at Charleroi and beyond. The German columns pressed forward, marching ever closer to Paris. The City of Lights trembled. In Paris, the fear was palpable. Refugees poured into the capital, their carts stacked high, their faces drawn. They spoke of villages burned, of soldiers marching like machines, of guns that seemed never to fall silent. Shops closed early. Train stations overflowed. Families considered leaving the city altogether. Whispers of evacuation spreading like wildfire. Even the government packed its papers and prepared to flee south to Bordeaux. It seemed, to many, that France might fall, that history would repeat itself, that the humiliation of 1870 would be lived again in an even harsher form. But not everyone was ready to give up. In early September, as German forces pressed dangerously close to Paris, the French commander, General Joseph Joffre, made his stand. He ordered a counterattack along the Marne River, calling upon weary soldiers to march once more, to fight one more time. Paris itself contributed. In one of the war's most famous scenes, the city's taxis, ordinary cabs painted black and red, were commandeered to ferry soldiers to the front. They rattled along cobbled streets, headlights cutting the night, carrying men with rifles across the threshold between ordinary life and history. Those who rode in them remembered the strangeness. One moment, sitting in the back of a taxi as though heading to a theater. The next, stepping out into fields where artillery thundered. The Battle of the Marne was chaos and determination. For days, armies clashed along a line stretching for miles. German forces, confident and close to victory, suddenly faced counterattacks that threatened to split their advance. French and British troops, exhausted but desperate, threw themselves into the fight. Fields turned to mud beneath trampling boots and falling shells. The air shook with the constant roar of artillery, with the cries of men, with the pounding of horses pulling guns across broken ground. Soldiers dug in wherever they could, scraping shallow trenches with their hands, holding on by sheer will. And then slowly, the tide turned. The German advance faltered. The perfect plan unraveled in the face of exhaustion, stretched supply lines, and the stubborn resistance of an enemy that refused to die quietly. By mid-September, the Germans pulled back, retreating to higher ground. Paris was saved. France was not lost. Newspapers called it a miracle, the miracle of the Marne. But miracles in war are written in blood, and the cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands of casualties in a matter of days. Whole regiments were gone, names wiped from the rolls. Families left to wonder why no letters came. The victory was real, but so was the grief. The retreat of the Germans did not end the war. Instead, both sides began what became known as the race to the sea. Each army tried to outflank the other, moving northward, striking, counterstriking, shifting along rail lines and muddy roads. From the Marne to the Aisne, from the Somme to Flanders, the fighting spread like fire along a fuse. By the time autumn came, the lines had stretched all the way to the North Sea. Neither side had broken the other. Both had bled. And in the end, they stopped running and began to dig. The trenches were at first shallow things, scrapes in the earth for shelter from bullets. But as the days turned into weeks, they deepened, lengthened, connected. Barbed wire was strung, duckboards laid, sandbags piled high. Soon, a vast network of earthworks stretched for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. Soldiers disappeared into the ground, living in narrow ditches where water pooled at their feet, where rats feasted on scraps, where the smell of sweat and gunpowder and rot hung heavy in the air. What had been a war of movement froze into a war of position. Life in the trenches was both monotonous and terrifying. Days passed in boredom, punctuated by hours of sheer horror. Soldiers crouched, writing letters home, scraping mud from their boots, sharing jokes whispered to pass the time. Then suddenly, the order would come to go over the top, to climb the ladders and rush into no man's land. That blasted stretch of earth between the lines, where machine guns waited and shells tore the ground apart. Many never returned. The survivors stumbled back covered in mud and blood, haunted by the faces of friends who had fallen beside them. Winter came, and with it a new layer of misery. Rain turned trenches into swamps. Men stood for days in water up to their knees, their skin swelling, blistering, rotting in what came to be called trench foot. Frost bit through uniforms. Snow fell into dugouts. The dead lay frozen in the wire, too dangerous to retrieve. And yet somehow life continued. Soldiers made tea over small fires. They sang songs, their voices rising into the night like fragile proof that humanity still breathed beneath the mud. They carved wood, played cards, wrote poetry. They clung to the fragments of normalcy they could find. In December of that first terrible year, something extraordinary happened along parts of the front. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers lit candles along their trenches, their voices carrying across no man's land in song. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The tune drifted through the cold air. British soldiers, astonished, recognized it and joined in, singing Silent Night in their own tongue. For a few hours, rifles were lowered. Men climbed from their trenches, meeting cautiously in the middle. They exchanged gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons, small tokens of goodwill. A football appeared, and in the mud of Flanders, enemies kicked it back and forth, laughing. Letters written afterward told of the strangeness of shaking hands with men who the day before had been targets. The truce did not last, could not last, but its memory lingered as proof that even in the darkest places, humanity flickered. But the war was not kind enough to let such moments endure. Artillery resumed, the guns speaking again with their terrible voices. The trenches deepened, the wire thickened, and the war that had been promised to end by Christmas stretched on into the new year, and then into another. The miracle of the Marne had saved France, but it had also condemned Europe to something new, something worse than anyone had expected. A war without end in sight, a war that swallowed men whole, a war of stalemate and attrition. For the generals, new plans were drawn. For the soldiers, new trenches were dug. For families at home, new letters arrived, black-edged and heavy with silence. And above it all, the guns thundered, endless, unrelenting, as if the earth itself had chosen to roar. The year turned, and 1915 began with little sign of relief. Snow clung to the parapets of the trenches, and the mud beneath froze into jagged ruts that tore at boots and ankles. Soldiers pulled their coats tighter, breath rising in white clouds, fingers stiff against the triggers of their rifles. The new year brought no truce, no peace. Only the steady rhythm of shells and the endless groaning of the wounded carried through the cold. Men who had once believed the war would end by Christmas now stared across no man's land and understood, bitterly, that there would be many Christmases yet before it was done. Life in the trenches became a routine of misery. Dawn patrols meant peering through periscopes to catch a glimpse of the enemy. Midday meant ration tins of bully beef, hard biscuits that cracked teeth, and tea brewed in blackened cans. The nights were long, filled with the scratching of rats that grew fat on crumbs and corpses, with the whimper of men who dreamed of home only to wake to the stench of mud and death. Letters arrived, smudged with fingerprints and the faint scent of lavender or bread from kitchens far away. They were read again and again until the paper wore thin, folded carefully into breast pockets as though they could shield a man from bullets. The generals planned new offensives, convinced that one more push might break the deadlock. Along the Western Front, attacks were prepared with meticulous detail. Artillery would thunder for days, a rolling barrage that shook the ground like an earthquake, meant to shatter the enemy before infantry advanced. Yet time and again, when the guns fell silent and whistles blew, men climbed from the trenches and were cut down by machine guns that had survived the bombardment. Entire battalions disappeared in minutes, swallowed by the unrelenting fire. At Neuve-Chapelle in March, at Ypres in April, at Loos in September, the story repeated. Courage met with carnage, ground gained measured not in miles but in yards, and always at a cost so great that no gain seemed enough. It was at Ypres that the war revealed a new horror. On a spring morning in April, German troops released thousands of cylinders of chlorine gas. The green-yellow cloud rolled across the fields, sinking into the trenches, clinging to the earth. Men coughed violently, eyes burning, lungs seared as though aflame from within. Some stumbled blindly, hands clawing at their throats. Others fell, choking, their skin turning blue. Panic spread as the gas moved like a living thing, silent and inescapable. Soldiers pressed rags to their mouths, urinated on cloths in desperate attempts to neutralize the poison. The battlefield became a scene from a nightmare, where air itself betrayed those who breathed it. The world recoiled. The use of poison gas was condemned as barbaric, yet once unleashed, it could not be contained. Soon, all sides would turn to it, another weapon in a war already overflowing with cruelty. The war was no longer confined to the trenches of France and Belgium. In the east, Russian armies clashed with Austro-Hungarian and German forces in battles of enormous scale. At Gorlice and Tarnow, whole fronts shifted, and Russian lines broke under heavy assault, sending soldiers streaming back across plains and forests. Villages were emptied, refugees trudging in endless lines, carts piled with belongings, cattle driven alongside, children crying in the cold. The vastness of the Eastern Front meant victories were larger, retreats deeper, but suffering was the same. Hunger, exhaustion, and grief. Far to the south, another campaign began that year, one that would etch itself into memory with equal parts valor and futility. Gallipoli. The plan had been bold, even visionary. By seizing control of the Dardanelles Strait, the Allies hoped to open a route to supply Russia, to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, to strike a blow that might shift the balance. In April, troops landed on the beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Among them were men from across the empire, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Britons, French. They came ashore under withering fire, climbing cliffs, clawing through sand and scrub, their comrades falling beside them. The landings were brutal. The beaches soon choked with the dead, the sea red with blood. Yet those who survived dug in, clinging to rocky slopes, enduring heat, thirst, and ceaseless attack. The Gallipoli campaign became a stalemate of its own. Trenches carved into cliffs, men fighting not only the enemy but also flies that swarmed over rotting corpses, thirst that cracked lips, dysentery that weakened bodies. Letters home spoke of courage and comradeship, of strange beauty in the Aegean sunsets, of the bond formed between men who faced death together every day. But they also spoke of despair, of hopeless assaults against impossible positions, of nights filled with the groans of the wounded and the constant crack of rifles. After months of suffering and no decisive progress, the campaign was abandoned. The Allies withdrew, leaving behind graves carved into the hillsides. For Australia and New Zealand especially, Gallipoli became a national memory, a place where identity was forged in sacrifice and sorrow. Beyond Gallipoli, the war reached even farther. In Africa, colonial troops fought under their imperial banners, carrying rifles across deserts and jungles, clashing in campaigns far from the European heart of the conflict. In the Middle East, Ottoman forces battled British troops near the Suez, while in Mesopotamia, Rivers once known to ancient empires now carried gunboats and soldiers. In the seas, submarines prowled, striking merchant ships, pulling even civilians into the war's vast net. Nowhere seemed untouched. Back on the Western Front, 1915 ground on. More trenches were dug, more barbed wire strung, more lives lost for little gain. Artillery grew heavier, shells more numerous. Villages were obliterated, their names reduced to coordinates on maps. Soldiers grew hardened, their humor dark, their patience thin. They painted slogans on dugout walls, sang songs filled with irony, clung to rituals that gave shape to days otherwise swallowed by mud and monotony. And always, the letters went back and forth. Promises of return, reassurances of safety, lies told out of love. As the year ended, the war showed no sign of ending with it. Instead, it stretched like an endless road, the horizon always out of reach. What had begun as a rush of armies had settled into a grinding contest, each side bleeding the other, each waiting for the other to collapse. The hope of quick victory was gone. The war had become something deeper, something heavier, something that would demand far more than anyone had ever imagined. The year was 1916, and by then the war was no longer new. The first flush of excitement, the cheering crowds and promises of a quick return, had long since faded into silence. Across Europe, towns bore the absence of their sons like missing teeth. Trains still carried soldiers, but the station farewells had grown quieter, the smiles more forced, the embraces longer. Families no longer said, "See you in a few months." They said nothing at all, pressing letters into hands, blessing foreheads with trembling lips, clinging to the hope that silence was not the last word they would share. The Western Front stretched from the sea to the Swiss border, a scar across the face of the continent. It had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, and still the generals believed victory might be wrested from it by force of will. For Germany, one city became the chosen target, Verdun, a fortress town on the Meuse River. Its name carried deep weight in the French heart. To lose Verdun would be more than a military setback. It would be a humiliation, a wound to the soul of France itself. And so, in February of 1916, German guns opened fire. The bombardment was unlike anything seen before. For hours, for days, shells rained down, the earth heaving and splitting, trees shredded, villages erased. French defenders crouched in cellars and bunkers, deafened by the endless roar, choked by the dust that filled every crevice. When the infantry came, gray waves rising out of smoke, they found ground already broken, but not empty. French soldiers, battered but unyielding, fought from ruined forts, from shattered houses, from craters that had once been fields. Verdun became a furnace. Month after month, the battle raged, both sides pouring in men and munitions. The Germans hoped to bleed France white, to grind down their enemy until it could no longer fight. But the French, led by General Philippe Pétain, clung to the city with a grim vow: "They shall not pass." Supplies were carried along a single lifeline, the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, where trucks rumbled day and night, carrying ammunition forward, wounded men back. Dust rose from the road, mingling with the cries of drivers pushing their engines to the limit. Soldiers rotated through the line, spending a few weeks in hell before being relieved, though many never left at all. By summer, Verdun had devoured hundreds of thousands of lives. Men who survived spoke of the place with haunted eyes. They described hills flattened by shells, forts reduced to rubble, whole landscapes turned into moonscapes where nothing grew, where the air reeked of death. They described the ceaseless noise, the thunder of guns that shook bones, that made the earth itself seem alive with rage. For 10 months the battle dragged on, a symbol of endurance, of madness, of the way pride and resolve could trap nations in carnage. When it finally ebbed at the year's end, the lines had barely shifted. France had not fallen, but nearly 1 million men had been killed or wounded. Verdun stood, but at a cost so terrible it left scars not only on the land but on the French soul. While Verdun burned, the Allies prepared their own hammer blow. The Somme, planned as a relief, a way to draw German forces away from Verdun, it became something larger, something that symbolized the scale of the war's futility. On July 1, 1916, British soldiers climbed from their trenches and advanced across no man's land. They marched shoulder to shoulder, lines of khaki against the green fields of northern France, confident after a week-long artillery bombardment that the enemy had been destroyed. But the German defenders had endured, deep in dugouts, their machine guns waiting. When the whistles blew and the men moved forward, they were cut down in droves. That first day of the Somme became the bloodiest in British history. Nearly 60,000 casualties in a single day, 20,000 dead. Whole regiments annihilated. Young men who had trained together, sung together, dreamed of adventure together, now lay together in the mud. Villages in England would never see their sons again. Streets would remember them as names carved on memorials, photographs in frames hung on parlors, stories told by mothers to children too young to remember. And still the battle went on. For months, through the heat of summer and the rains of autumn, the fighting continued. Villages like Thiepval, Beaumont-Hamel, and Flers became names synonymous with suffering. Artillery churned the fields into oceans of mud. Shells exploded day and night, the ground trembling, the sky flashing with fire. Men lived in ditches filled with water, their boots rotting from their feet, their spirits worn down by the endless thunder. And yet they fought, because the orders kept coming, because the hope of breaking through still glimmered in distant headquarters. At the Somme, a new weapon made its debut. The tank. Great lumbering machines, armored and armed with cannons, they rolled forward on caterpillar tracks, crossing trenches, crushing wire. They were slow, clumsy, prone to breaking down, but they represented the future. Soldiers cheered as they passed, marveling at the sight of steel beasts moving where men could not. But in 1916, they were too few, too fragile, to change the course of the battle. The war would not be ended by miracles of invention. Not yet. By November, the Battle of the Somme ended, not with victory but with exhaustion. The Allies had advanced a few miles. The Germans had held firm. The cost? More than 1 million casualties combined. Like Verdun, the Somme became a symbol, not of triumph but of sacrifice, of courage thrown against the unyielding wall of modern war. For France, Verdun was memory. For Britain, the Somme. Both stood as monuments to the year when Europe bled without end. Away from the front lines, the war pressed into every corner of life. In the towns and villages behind the trenches, women filled the factories, their hands stained with the dust of explosives, their lungs choked by fumes. They packed shells, sewed uniforms, tended fields left empty by men who would not return. Children learned to live with shortages, with ration cards, with the fear in their mothers' eyes when the postman came up the path. Churches rang with prayers, funerals filled with black. And yet amid it all, music was still played, weddings still held, babies still born. Life persisted, stubborn and fragile. In hospitals, rows of beds filled with the broken. Men without arms, without legs, without faces. Nurses moved between them, bringing water, adjusting bandages, writing letters for those whose hands could no longer hold pens. Some men longed to return to the front, to join their comrades once more. Others stared into the distance, wishing only for silence, unable to speak of what they had seen. The war was creating not only graves but ghosts who walked while still alive. Farther afield, other battles raged. In the east, Russia launched the Brusilov offensive, one of the most successful of the war, smashing Austro-Hungarian lines, capturing tens of thousands. For a moment, the empire tottered. But Russia's success came at a terrible cost, its own armies bleeding as much as they gained. In Italy, battles ground on along the Isonzo River, men fighting on mountain slopes where snow turned red, where avalanches buried whole companies, where peaks became cemeteries. In the Middle East, British and Ottoman forces clashed at Kut, at Gallipoli's shadowed shores, at desert outposts where heat was as deadly as bullets. And beyond even the battlefields, the war stretched into the seas. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships, pulling neutral nations ever closer to the fight. Civilians, once distant from the front, now found themselves targets. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, and fear spread across oceans. By the end of 1916, Europe was weary. Verdun and the Somme had consumed millions. Families mourned. Soldiers endured. Politicians promised victory, but faith wavered. What had begun with parades and cheering crowds was now a long march through blood and mud, with no end in sight. The war had become not an event but a condition, a reality that defined every life it touched. And still, the guns thundered on. The winter of 1916 into 1917 was one of the harshest in memory. Along the Western Front, snow lay thick across the trenches, masking the devastation beneath a blanket that fooled no one. The ground was frozen, the air so sharp it cut through wool coats and gnawed at fingers. Men shivered in dugouts, their breath misting the darkness, their boots stiff with frost. Rats scurried over the frozen dead, gnawing at scraps of food and flesh alike. When the sun rose, weak and pale, it revealed a landscape of misery. Shattered trees coated in ice, wire fences brittle with frost, fields cratered and filled with icy water. Soldiers wrote home not of victories or defeats but of cold, of hunger, of aching limbs. "We are alive," some scribbled. But that is all. By 1917, the war had settled into its terrible rhythm. Battles erupted, flared, and subsided, each one promising breakthrough and delivering only blood. Verdun and the Somme had already shown that courage could not overcome the machine guns, that sacrifice alone could not shift the lines. Yet the generals kept planning, convinced that one more great push would finally shatter the stalemate. The soldiers obeyed, because to disobey was unthinkable, because comradeship bound them, because hope still lingered somewhere beneath the mud. But cracks were beginning to show, not only in the lines but in the societies behind them. In Britain, rationing grew harsher, food scarcer. In France, soldiers marched but grumbled, their letters filled with bitterness, their eyes dull with fatigue. And in Russia, the great empire of the East, the strain of war became too heavy to bear. Russia had suffered enormously since 1914. Its armies, vast but poorly supplied, had been hurled into battles against Germany and Austria-Hungary, often with little more than rifles and courage. Millions had died. Millions more had been captured or wounded. The home front groaned under shortages. In Petrograd, queues for bread stretched for blocks, women waiting in the bitter cold with empty baskets, hoping the bakeries would not run out before their turn came. Factories ground to a halt for want of coal. Soldiers sent to the front without boots wrapped rags around their feet. Letters from the trenches spoke of hunger, of despair, of officers detached from their men. The Tsar Nicholas II remained aloof, convinced of his divine right, blind to the desperation building around him. In February, the breaking point came. Protests began in Petrograd, women demanding bread, workers demanding relief. Soldiers sent to disperse them joined them instead, lowering their rifles, marching alongside the crowds. The Tsar's ministers faltered, his authority crumbled, and within days, Nicholas abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was gone in an instant. A provisional government took power, promising reform, promising democracy, but also promising to continue the war. To many this was betrayal. They had not risen against hunger and tyranny to keep bleeding for a war that seemed endless. Into this chaos stepped voices of revolution. Lenin, long exiled, returned to Russia with promises of peace, land and bread. His words carried like sparks in dry grass. Soldiers, weary of the front, deserted in droves. Peasants seized estates. Workers took over factories. Russia, once the giant of the East, was unraveling. By autumn, a second revolution swept Petrograd. The Bolsheviks seized power, declaring a new order, a new future. And in March of 1918, they would sign a peace treaty with Germany, pulling Russia from the war entirely. But in 1917, as revolution thundered, the Eastern Front began to dissolve, and Germany turned its eyes west, freed at last to focus on France and Britain. Yet even as Russia fell, another giant stirred across the ocean. The United States had watched the war from afar, divided in its sympathies, hesitant to step into Europe's quarrels. President Woodrow Wilson spoke of neutrality, of peace without victory, of staying apart from the madness. But the sea made neutrality fragile. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships without warning. The Lusitania, torpedoed in 1915, had already shocked America, killing more than 100 of its citizens. By 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare resumed, and American vessels fell victim again. The final straw came with the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal urging Mexico to join the war against the United States, promising lost territories in return. When it was revealed, outrage swept America. In April, Wilson went before Congress. His words were solemn, heavy with purpose. The world must be made safe for democracy. The United States declared war on Germany. Though its army was small, its industry was vast, its people ready to rally. American troops would take time to arrive, to train, to cross the ocean. But the very promise of their coming shifted the balance. Germany knew the clock was ticking now. Time was no longer its ally. On the Western Front, the war dragged on. The spring brought the Nivelle Offensive, a grand French assault promised to deliver victory in 48 hours. Instead, it collapsed into slaughter. The men, exhausted, furious, refused to continue. Whole units mutinied, singing songs of defiance, refusing to climb from the trenches. It was not cowardice. They would defend their lines if attacked, but they would not throw themselves into another futile assault. The French army cracked, and only careful promises, rest, and changes in command kept it from breaking entirely. The mutinies were hushed, censored, but the truth lingered. Faith in the generals was gone. In Britain, the burden fell heavier each month. The Battle of Passchendaele in Flanders became a symbol of futility. The rains came early, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in mud, sucked beneath the surface, their cries silenced as comrades reached too late. Horses floundered and died in the mire. Artillery pieces sank until only their barrels showed. And yet, the battle went on for months, for yards gained, for names written on orders that cost thousands of lives. Veterans remembered Passchendaele not for glory but for mud, for the smell, for the sound of boots being pulled free again and again, for the faces of men who never emerged. 1917 was a year of exhaustion and transformation. At home, civilians felt the weight of war more than ever. In Germany, hunger stalked the streets as the British blockade cut off supplies. Families survived on turnips and thin bread. In France, villages lay in ruins, fields untended, the land itself scarred. In Britain, rationing tightened, factories ran day and night, women filling the roles once held by men. The war was no longer something fought only at the front. It was in kitchens, in breadlines, in the silence of empty chairs at supper tables. Yet amid despair, hope flickered. The knowledge that America was coming, that new strength would arrive, sustained the Allies. Wilson's words, idealistic as they were, inspired visions of a better world after the carnage, a world where democracy and peace might triumph. Soldiers read them in newspapers, skeptics still but willing to let hope carry them another day. And in the quiet moments, even amid the mud and horror, humanity endured. A soldier in the French lines carved a small wooden bird from a splintered beam, placing it on his dugout shelf as if to remind himself that life could still take flight. A British nurse in a field hospital sang softly to a dying boy, her voice carrying through the ward until others joined in, the melody fragile but real. A German soldier, writing by candlelight, told his wife not of battles but of the stars he saw above the trenches, the same stars he imagined she saw from their village far away. By the year's end, the war had not ended. It had grown. Russia had collapsed. America had entered. The Western Front still held, but only just. Millions more had died, millions more waited their turn. And the world itself seemed to be splitting at its seams, old empires trembling, new powers rising. 1917 was the year the war ceased to be only a European struggle. It became the world's war, total and consuming. And still the guns thundered on. The winter of 1917 bled into 1918, with no clear end in sight. Europe was weary, scarred, worn thin by years of war. For long years had passed since Sarajevo, for years since the shots that had shattered the fragile peace of the continent. Millions were dead, millions more maimed, millions more waiting in trenches that stretched like scars across the earth. Yet the war continued, because no one could imagine how to stop it, because pride and fear and promises held the nations fast. For Germany, the moment seemed both desperate and full of opportunity. With Russia gone from the war, bound by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Eastern Front was closed. Whole divisions of German troops could now be moved west. The generals, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, believed this was their chance. Before the Americans could arrive in full strength, before the Allies could gather new resources, Germany would strike. One last offensive, massive and decisive, would break the stalemate, smash through the Allied lines, and force peace on German terms. In March the attack began. It was called the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, or simply the Spring Offensive. At dawn on the 21st, the German guns roared to life. Thousands of shells pounded the British lines, not in a steady rhythm but in a rolling storm that confused and disoriented defenders. Then came the stormtroopers, specially trained units that moved fast, bypassing strongpoints, slipping through weak spots, sowing panic behind the lines. The British, exhausted, stretched thin, reeled under the assault. Town after town fell. Whole units were pushed back miles and days. For a moment, it seemed the German plan was working. The front shifted for the first time in years, arrows on maps racing forward. But momentum is a fragile thing. The German supply lines strained. Soldiers advanced faster than food and ammunition could follow. Horses collapsed in the mud, wagons overturned, men grew hungry, their strength faltering. And each day that passed brought more American troops closer to the line. The United States, slow to mobilize, had now begun pouring men into France by the tens of thousands each month. Young, fresh, unwearied by years of trench life, they carried energy and morale that the weary Allies desperately needed. By summer, more than 1 million Americans were in Europe, with more on the way. The window for Germany's victory was closing. The offensives faltered. At the Marne once more in July, the German tide reached its high-water mark. The Allies counterattacked, French and American forces striking back with determination. The German advance was halted, then rolled backward. Ludendorff's gamble had failed. Germany had thrown everything into the offensive, and it had not been enough. The army still fought fiercely, but the balance had shifted. The Allies now had the numbers, the supplies, the fresh spirit to push forward. From August came what the Allies called the 100 Days Offensive. This was not a single battle but a relentless series of attacks, hammering the Germans again and again. At Amiens in August, British, Australian, Canadian, and American troops surged forward with tanks, aircraft, and artillery in coordination. The German lines, so long unbreakable, cracked. Prisoners poured into Allied hands by the thousands. Ludendorff himself called it the Black Day of the German army. From then on, the retreat never truly stopped. In the villages of northern France and Belgium, bells that had been silent for years began to ring again as liberating troops entered. Civilians emerged from cellars, from barns, from exile, greeting soldiers with tears and embraces. Fields that had been barren were trampled once more, but this time in hope, not despair. The war was not yet over, but for the first time in years, the end could be imagined. Yet even as armies fought, the empires that had begun the war began to collapse. In Austria-Hungary, the patchwork quilt of nations pulled apart at the seams. Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Slovenes, all demanded independence, their voices rising as the empire's armies faltered. By autumn, Vienna could no longer hold them together. The centuries-old Habsburg realm disintegrated, its crown passed into history. The Ottoman Empire, too, crumbled. In the Middle East, British forces under General Allenby captured Jerusalem, then Damascus, driving Ottoman troops back. Arab fighters, promised independence, rose in revolt, striking from the desert, sabotaging railways, seizing towns. The old empire that had stretched across 3 continents was breaking apart, its provinces slipping away one by one. Even in Germany itself, cracks spread. The blockade strangled the nation. Food grew scarce, hunger gnawed at every household. Workers struck, demanding peace. Soldiers muttered in the trenches, their letters filled not with patriotism but with despair. When the Navy ordered a final suicidal sortie in October, sailors refused. Mutiny spread from ship to ship, then into the cities. Revolution whispered in the streets. The Kaiser, once a figure of majesty, found his authority crumbling. By November, he would flee into exile in the Netherlands, his empire collapsing behind him. And so, as autumn deepened, the war at last neared its end. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. The armistice had been signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France. After more than 4 years of blood, the Great War was over. On the front lines, men looked around in disbelief. The silence was heavier than the thunder that had preceded it. Birds sang, cautiously at first, then louder, as though reclaiming the sky. Soldiers wept, embraced, sat down where they were with blank stares. Some laughed hysterically. Others simply slept, their bodies finally allowed to rest. The war was over, but the weight of it would never leave them. In villages across Europe, church bells rang. Families rushed into the streets. Flags waved, embraces were shared. But for every celebration, there was mourning. Millions were gone. Millions more returned broken, scarred, silent. Empires had fallen. Borders had shifted. The world was changed forever. In Paris, leaders gathered in the months that followed to shape the peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany, carving its borders, demanding reparations, placing blame. The treaty was meant to secure peace, but its terms planted seeds of bitterness, seeds that would grow in the years to come. The Great War had ended, but the world it left behind was not the same. The old order had crumbled. New powers had risen. And though people prayed that this had been the war to end all wars, history would prove otherwise. The butterfly had flapped its wings in Sarajevo in 1914. For years later, the storm had circled the globe. And though the guns had ceased, their echo would ring through the century. The guns of the Great War fell silent on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour. Across the scarred landscape of Europe, the sudden quiet spread like a tide. Men who had crouched in mud for years, who had lived beneath thunder and fire, now listened in disbelief to the absence of sound. Birds returned cautiously, their wings flashing against skies once choked with smoke. The wind rustled through wire and shattered trees. It was peace, though fragile, though incomplete, though heavy with loss. In the days that followed, soldiers packed their gear. Some marched home to parades, their uniforms ragged but their heads held high. Others limped, carried, or wheeled themselves into hospitals, their bodies broken in ways that could never be mended. Millions more would never return, their names etched into memorials of stone. Their graves stretching in endless rows across the fields of France, Belgium, Gallipoli, Salonika, Mesopotamia, Africa, the seas. White crosses, simple and stark, marked lives ended far too soon. In villages, in cities, in quiet churchyards, bells tolled in mourning as much as in celebration. The war had cost more than anyone had imagined. 9 million soldiers dead, tens of millions wounded, civilians starved by blockades, massacred in occupations, lost to disease that followed armies like a shadow. The Spanish flu, carried by soldiers moving across continents, swept the globe, killing millions more than the war itself. In its wake, households sat empty, fields untended, voices silenced forever. Empires that had seemed eternal were gone. Austria-Hungary dissolved, its many peoples claiming independence. The Ottoman Empire broke apart, its lands divided by victors, its people scattered into mandates and protectorates. Russia had fallen into revolution and civil war, its monarchy executed, its people caught between hunger and ideology. Even victorious empires, Britain and France, emerged strained, their colonies restless, their economies shaken. The United States, new to the world stage, stood stronger, its industry untouched, its soldiers fresh, its voice ready to shape the century to come. The peace that followed was uneasy. In Versailles, leaders gathered to write treaties, to draw borders, to carve new nations from old empires. The maps of Europe and the Middle East shifted like pieces on a board, lines drawn with ink that would one day bleed. Germany, blamed for the war, bore the heaviest burden: reparations, disarmament, humiliation. Its people, hungry and bitter, carried wounds that treaties could not heal. The words carved into the document were meant to secure peace, but they planted resentment. Resentment that would one day grow into another storm. And yet, in those first months after the war, ordinary people longed simply to live again. Farmers sowed fields left untended. Children returned to schools that still smelled of dust and disuse. Churches filled with prayers of thanks and remembrance. Couples married quickly, eager to reclaim years lost. In cafes, laughter returned, though it was softer now, tinged with memory. People carried scars invisible and visible, but they also carried on, because life demands it, because hope is as stubborn as grief. In literature, in art, in music, the war echoed. Poets wrote of mud and death, of futility and sacrifice. Painters filled canvases with jagged lines and broken forms, reflecting the fracture of the world they had known. Composers wrote mournful requiems, the notes carrying sorrow across concert halls and quiet rooms alike. A generation of writers, often called the Lost Generation, spoke of alienation, of disillusionment, of searching for meaning in a world that had betrayed their youth. In memory, too, the war endured. Every village erected monuments. Every family carried its dead in photographs framed above mantels. in medals tucked into drawers, in letters read until the ink faded. Veterans gathered in silence, their eyes meeting across rooms where words were unnecessary. The trenches were gone, filled in or reclaimed by grass, but in minds they remained, endless lines of mud and wire stretching across dreams. The butterfly that had flapped its wings in Sarajevo on that summer morning of 1914 had set into motion a storm that reshaped the globe. One young man, Gavrilo Princip, thin and sickly, fired 2 shots into a carriage. He could not have known the weight of what he did. He could not have seen the trenches, the gas, the tanks, the ruined cities, the fallen empires, the millions of dead. He carried only his dream of defiance. Yet history is not written only by kings and parliaments, but by chance and choice, by accidents and intentions intertwined. In the stillness after the war, many asked, was it worth it? Could anything justify the cost? Politicians spoke of honor, of duty, of victory. But the faces of widows and orphans, the crutches of maimed soldiers, the endless graves stretching to the horizon, told another story. The war had ended, but the questions remained, whispered across generations, never fully answered. The 20th century would be shaped by its aftermath. The League of Nations was formed, an attempt to prevent such slaughter again, fragile but hopeful. Independence movements stirred in colonies, inspired by words of freedom, determined to claim their own destinies. In Germany, bitterness festered. In Russia, a new order rose. The war had not ended history. It had only begun a new chapter, one filled with tension and possibility, with shadows and with light. And yet, even as the world turned toward the future, the memory of the Great War lingered in the present. Armistice Day was marked each year with silence at the 11th hour, heads bowed, hearts heavy. Veterans marched in parades, their steps uneven, their faces solemn. Children asked their parents why bells rang, why poppies grew in fields once soaked with blood. And parents answered as best they could, often with tears, often with silence. History remembers battles and treaties, kings and generals. But it also remembers the small things. A letter written in pencil by candlelight, promising to come home. A photograph tucked into a breast pocket, stained with mud. A song sung softly in a trench at Christmas. A nurse's hand on a soldier's brow. A prayer whispered into cold night air. These, too, are part of the story. The butterfly effect of history is not only the great storms unleashed, but the fragile wings that keep beating amid them. Every life touched another, every choice rippled outward. From Sarajevo to the Marne, from Verdun to the Somme, from Gallipoli to the deserts of Arabia, from Petrograd to Washington, the ripples spread. And in those ripples, the modern world was born. So, as you listen now, as you drift toward rest, remember, history is not distant. It is made in moments, in choices, in accidents, in whispers and in shots. One life, one act, one decision can change the course of nations. A boy on a street corner, a carriage turning down the wrong road, a pistol lifted, 2 shots fired, and the world was never the same. Close your eyes. Hear the silence after the guns. Picture the fields growing green again. The flowers rising where craters once were. The sky clear of smoke. The rivers flowing quietly once more. Imagine the laughter of children returning to streets that had been empty. The bells ringing not for mourning but for weddings. The footsteps of soldiers no longer marching to war but to home. History carries sorrow, but it also carries resilience. And in its butterfly wings, it carries us forward, reminding us that even in the darkest storms, there is always the chance for light. And now let the story rest.